I also wanted to thank you all for coming. I think many of the folks here knew my mom and dad when they were alive, and I think maybe that's why a lot of you are here, and I think that's really sweet. Many of you knew my mom and dad, and thank you all for coming. They never did this, and they probably wouldn't have ever done this, so we're doing it for them tonight.
Don't forget to tell them about stuff in the library.
Oh yes, I have some props and some show and tell, so afterwards we're going to have a little Q&A, and then we're going to go to the library where I can show you some cool stuff. If you're interested, you can also just go home if you're not interested. So, I grew up in Buffalo, New York, and when you're a kid, your life is normal. So I grew up, the snow was that high when I was walking home from kindergarten, and I thought, everybody walks home with the snow this high in kindergarten. And as you get older, I'm going to shout because the people in the back can't hear me, I apologize. But as you get older, you realize, well, some people live in Florida and they have palm trees and they don't have snow. And some people live in the desert. There's all different kinds of people. I also started realizing that my parents spoke a different language, and I understood it, but I answered in English. I understood that the neighbor kids had grandparents and cousins and aunts and uncles, and I didn't. And with each successive sort of period in your life, this process sort of comes together, and you kind of realize after a while you're a family of a Holocaust survivor, and that has certain implications, and you learn certain things. And to some extent, that's been a lifelong educational process that I'm still continuing. So tonight's talk is about my dad, but of course my mom's in there too. I know so much less about my mom. My sources for tonight are my dad's stories. It's my dad. They're not necessarily true. Many of you know him. But he used to tell these stories, these anecdotes, sort of almost like jokes. And he told them enough that it was obvious to me they were important. They were the messages that he wanted us to receive as his children. The other source is this book here. This is a Yisker book. Many towns, Jewish communities that perished in the Holocaust, there were enough survivors that put together these books. These books are like high school annuals. It tells the history of the formation of the town, who all the important people are, how the town was formed, the politics, the whatever, and then it talks about the destruction of the town, the Nazi occupation and destruction. So this book is written in Hebrew and Yiddish. And about 15 years ago or so, me and a professor over in Atlanta had it translated. And that was a 3-year project. I certainly wish I had done that when my dad was alive, because I would have learned a lot more and had a lot more to ask. But nevertheless, I learned a lot about my family history in the town from this book. And finally, I've just been doing some general research. And although this is going to bother Ann, I want to thank Ann publicly for helping me do research and learn how to make a PowerPoint and learn how to be organized and think chronologically and make sense out of all these little stories. So thank you, Ann, and I'm sorry.
And I would like to make a plug here that I should have said earlier. While Abe he's saying that this is a first time for him telling his father's story to adults. One of my passion projects, and something Ann and I talk about often, is our Guardians of Remembrance project. And this is not necessarily just for second and third generation survivors, but for volunteers as well. To adopt a story of a survivor, and it doesn't have to be an Alabama survivor on these walls, obviously, but it can be someone that maybe does not have a guardian of their story in their lives, or that we do not have a connection with their family members locally. And if you want to pursue that and become a speaker on behalf of that survivor through our organization, we would love, love, love for y'all to do that. I see some of our speakers in the audience today that have done that with their own family members, and Ann and I would coach you and train you, as well as maybe even Abe, to see if y'all would be able to do that. But I really do want y'all to think about that as an option. It's not full-time or even really full part-time work, but we we need help preserving these stories. So thank you, Abe.
You're welcome. So this is the book that I just showed you, and this is a page from the book. The Nazis did a really good job doing censuses and figuring out who lived there. And this is the only picture I have of my grandmother and grandfather, which you'll see later from this book. Well, where was my dad from? He was from Sarny. Sarny is almost in the dead center of Europe. It's in the northwestern corner of the Ukraine, just below Belarus and east of Poland today. Also in the Ukraine 18. In 1919, when my dad was born, it was actually part of Poland. And one thing I learned from this book, between 1903 and 1942, Sarny changed sovereignty 5 times. So these borderlands weren't necessarily part of any given country for very long. At one point, there was a man named Simon Petlura. He was a warlord, and he had control of this region. These are pictures from the book. This is Handlova Street, which was the main commerce street in town. And this is from approximately 1920. And I just want you all to think about, if you were in Leeds or Bessemer, another small town in Alabama, what it might look like in 1920 compared to this place. Any comments? Paul?
It looks like out west somewhere.
Right. It's one of the high school kids in Leeds said, that'd be real basic. And there was no sidewalks. The streets were mud. They weren't paved. The main street had a couple of 2-story buildings. I'm believing this is electric pole, but there was no electricity in the houses. There was certainly no indoor plumbing. Everybody had outhouses. There were wells. In 1920, in Poland, Ukraine area, this was a nasty place. It was a poor place. It wasn't, even for that time, even for that part of the world, it was not a nice place. This is a picture from the book. I don't know whose house that was, but my dad said their house was made out of scrap wood and they built it themselves. He said, you didn't have to have a mortgage. You just got scrap wood and you just built it. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So this, in my imagination, is how I visualize how my dad grew up. All these people lived in the area. And while the sovereignty, the countries changed all the time, the people identified with their nationality. And the Jews were a nation. They were the Jews. And the Russians, Poles, Germans, Ukrainians, the same. These people lived together in some amount of harmony, but the Jews in particular were so isolated in their community that they did not even speak the other languages. So they literally lived together without really being able to talk to each other. In this particular community, it was not an integrated kind of place. Sarny was established in 1903, at that time by the Tsar of Russia, because there had been a bunch of pogroms. Those are murderous riots where a lot of Jews had been murdered and displaced, and they set up about 100 new villages to allow Jews to go settle there so they can stimulate commerce and trade and help out the Tsar. And this is one of those villages. There were limitations. They did not have equal rights. They had to live within the city limits. They formed a shtetl. They spoke their own language. And again, the sovereignty changed all the time. This is my uncle who survived. He died 2 Januaries ago. And he did there's a little sound on this, and he did an interview with my cousin in Israel. And this is another source. I learned a lot about my family from this interview that was done about 2 years ago. And if you could just press play and move it to about here and just hear his voice for a second. Just move it forward, if you don't mind. Yeah, that's good. That's good. So I just wanted you to hear his voice because for people who knew my dad, they about looked and sounded just alike. And he, in this, I don't know, 30 or 40 minutes tells a lot, and a lot of stuff that I never knew till I listened to this. So here's the family tree. My grandpa, who I was named after, Avram, his wife Henya, or Anya they called her, and they had 7 children. I didn't know all their names till I saw that tape because my dad just never talked about it. But his older brother and sister survived. He survived. Liepman survived. The 3 younger and the parents perished. And it's a pretty amazing story because the odds were not that good, but they were extraordinarily lucky people. So what was the culture or the mood of the town? You know, every community has a different sort of nature or a different sort of personality. You know, in Birmingham, it's about college football, whatever. So in Sarny, there are two important things, and one was scholarliness. The rabbis were, you know, Sabin and Charles Barkley, and they were the rabbis. They were the most revered, important people in town, and these were some of the rabbis who were all written about in that book. And the goal was, for boys in particular, if you were a boy, to be learned in Torah, to be learned in the Bible, and to go to school, and hopefully to go to high school. If you're really lucky and really bright, you maybe could go to Vilna or Warsaw someday and even study further. That was the culture of the community. The other really strong thing that happened in Sarny was Zionism. And for those of you who don't know what Zionism is, it's very simply, it was a movement to establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine, and the historic home of the Jewish people, which was a new idea in 1897 and did not take hold among all the Jewish people, still does not take hold among all the Jewish people. There are some very religious people who don't believe it and so on. But in Sarny, it was a huge deal. And the reason is they had just given up after all these years on being able to have a normal life in that part of the world. It was just too difficult. So they set up all these groups. They set up what they called kibbutzim, or work farms. They would go on the weekends camping and work and teach the men and women how to use tools and farm in preparation for pioneering and going to the land of Israel. There were about 6 or 7 different movements from the left wing to the right wing, but they were all Zionist movements, and every kid belonged to one of them, and it was a big part of the culture of Sarny. At age 6, my dad went to Cheder, which is the Jewish school. He studied, he learned some Bible, some Torah, he learned in Yiddish. They also learned Hebrew as a spoken language, which is really weird. Hebrew was the holy language back then, but the culture of this city was to prepare these kids from kindergarten to go to Israel. So they were learning Hebrew as a spoken language, which my father kind of thought he spoke. This picture is in 1929, and those kids were about 10 years old in school, and for all I know, one of those kids could be my dad. It could be a school picture. But I'd like to, but I don't know. I'm going to call on this lady, because I don't know her. Look at those kids and tell me how they look to you, just generally speaking.
School picture.
School picture. Milton, you see anything unusual?
Looks like there's more women than I don't see too many men.
Yeah, I don't know. I think the boys are all wearing shorts. It's
The clothes are weird.
clothes are funny because it's 1929, but what the kid at Shades Valley said was, those kids are malnourished. That's exactly what the kid said. This town in 1929, this is before the Holocaust, before this town was a poor place, and a couple of the teachers had a little fat on them. But all these kids, their legs are like this big.
Yeah.
And that's just how it was back then.
That's because they had to walk and didn't have cars to drive.
They didn't have cars, didn't have air conditioning, toilets, telephones, or food. So this guy is an important guy in the book, and he's an important guy in my family's life. Yaakov Brick was a merchant tailor, and he sewed clothes and made clothes for a lot of the Polish noblemen, the lords, some of the people who owned the lumber business, worked at the train station, and he was very well respected. Although he did not speak perfect Polish, he was able to communicate in Polish, and he functioned unofficially as the liaison between the Polish community and the Jewish community. So he helped with tax assessments. If people were arrested or in trouble, he would kind of be the middleman, and he was very well respected by both communities. And he was an important person in my father's life, because when my dad was 13, his parents pulled him out of school and sent him to the brick house to be a tailor, to learn to be a tailor, to be an apprentice. And I knew that because my dad told me that. What I didn't know until reading that book, that no one in Sarny would take a kid out of high school, that only the poorest of the poor would do that, because education was of such value, and at least try to get your son, through high school. But it wasn't going to be in our family. My grandfather was a World War I vet, and he was disabled, and they just didn't have many means. So my dad loved this guy. He lived in his house. For the first year or two, he mopped, he cleaned, he took the soil to the outhouse in the morning, the night soil, and he drew water from the well. But he taught him how to be a tailor, and he worked really hard to teach him how to be a tailor, and my dad tried to become a really good tailor. He also treated my dad really well. He loved him, and he treated him like his sons, and the Brick kids, there were a bunch of Brick kids, were like brothers and sisters to him. He wasn't the boy. They treated him like family. He's allowed to come and go and see his own family whenever he wanted. Yaakov Brick perished in the Holocaust, which is really sad, and several of his children survived and went to Israel before the war, and then my dad, when he went to Israel in the 60s, actually met up with his Brick brothers and sisters. Now we're going to talk about my Aunt Pessia. She was a really cool lady. She was, yeah. It's a pretty narrow gene pool in our family. She was older than my dad, and she really bought into this Zionist thing. And she worked in these work camps and got tough. And she went in 1933 by boat from Hamburg to Palestine. She ultimately had 4 children, and there's 5 generations of descendants from her now in Israel. This is my wife Gail and I. Gail's in the back, and her, and I'm guessing that was about 2005. She was a founding member of Kibbutz Givat Brenner before Israel was established, and she stayed in kibbutz. Well, she stayed her whole life, but she stayed there to see it come all the way through to bankruptcy at the end, and said that she she was like 75 years old. She said, "I got a checkbook, got an electric bill." She thought that was pretty cool. So I can't remember when, about 1920, Sarnia became part of Poland. And in 1939, the Germans, the Third Reich, Greater Germany, and the Soviet Union, Stalin, made a pact to split Poland down the middle. And in eastern Poland, which is where Sarny was, the Soviets came in. And my dad remembered that very well from his childhood. He was 20 or so at the time. He tells the story, and it's one of his stories, that the Polish people, generally speaking, did not like the Soviets. They were anti-communist. They did not want to be part of the Soviet Union. And they got their hunting weapons and their pickaxes and their farming tools, and they went out there to fight the Soviet army. So my grandfather, the disabled guy, said, "We're all going to the basement where they keep the potatoes." They climbed underneath the house, and they just kind of hid there, and the Soviet army came in, artillery blasting. And my father said everybody was fine, they just lost their kitchen, so they just built the kitchen back. And after about 2-3 days, it calmed down, and the Soviets were there, and that's just how it was. It only lasted a couple years. In 1941, this splitting Poland thing was not enough for Hitler, and they decided they were going to invade the entire Soviet Union, and came in, of course, from the west, from western Poland all the way through, and eventually occupied Sarny. I'm going to talk now for a minute about my dad and his brother. When the Soviets came to town, they occupied for a while. When the Germans attacked, what they decided to do was abandon Sarny, abandon the western Ukraine, Poland, the western Ukraine, and retreat. On the way out, they burned all the bridges and roads, trains. They destroyed whatever they could destroy to slow the advance of the German troops. My dad and his brother were both invited to join the Soviet army, told to show up at the train station. That's just a picture from the book of the train station. I don't know anybody in that picture. But they went to the train station at a certain time and place, time to go to the Soviet army. I can imagine that at that point in both of their lives, that they had never been maybe more than 15 miles from home. They didn't have a car or a horse or a wagon. It was dangerous to travel through the woods. I'm not sure my dad had even been to the next town over. And here is reporting to join an army of a foreign country in a language that he doesn't speak, and he doesn't really know the future. Of course, it ends up saving his life, but he didn't know it at the time. And he developed a sort of mantra at this time that he told us over and over again. I think it's obvious he wanted us to understand that this is what motivated him to stay alive. But in English, it loosely translated to, I, Julius Schuster, born in Sarny in 1919, Mom, I am alive. And his goal was to survive and come back to Sarny and knock on the door and tell his mother that he was okay. And he knew in his mind that that was going to happen. And of course, implicit in that dream is that when you get there, your mother's going to be alive and the house is going to be there. And of course, it was all a fantasy, but it worked for him. So when he reported to the Sarny train station, his mother, who was poor, gave him a chicken, cooked an entire chicken for him. And if they had chicken, it was usually, on the Sabbath, on a Friday night. They didn't typically eat chicken. And for him to have an entire chicken by himself, it was a big deal. And she knew he was going to be hungry, that he wasn't going to be fed, and she knew it may be the last time she sees him, and she wanted him to have that. My dad was so homesick and so sad that he couldn't eat the chicken, so he gave it away. And for those who knew my dad, a lot of them did. He never passed food again the rest of his life. That was it for him and giving away food. But it was a tough day for him. So you asked my dad, what did he do in the army? He said, well, I was a tailor. And you're like, I never really got that because, soldiers, fight in divisions on fronts. But with the help of Anne, we do some research. Turns out tailors, shoemakers, they were on the front lines, literally making equipment for the troops right on the line as they're fighting, while they're fighting. Staying warm in the Russian winter and staying dressed, taking clothes off dead people, recutting them, refitting them, was part of the war. And that's what my dad did. And being able to be a tailor, being sometimes able to be inside, burning a few less calories, was another reason he was lucky enough to stay alive. Where did you sleep, Dad? Oh, we slept in the forest in these underground bunkers. I just couldn't really imagine it. You do some research, they're still finding. There's thousands of these bunkers in the woods in the former Soviet Union. They would dig these trenches and they would have room for about 100 men to sleep underground. And that's after they were out doing maneuvers or working during the day. They would camouflage and go there under night. And my dad would say when he was out, he was always afraid. And it wasn't until he got to the edge of the forest and he saw the landmarks and he knew he was close to home that he knew he was okay. He told a lot of stories about this period, and he said that in underground they would sleep 4 or 5 guys together and they would hold each other to stay warm. And he said a lot of people were sick, the disease was rampant, a lot of people had cholera, and they'd have high fevers and they'd be hot. And he would sleep next to them and hold them really tight because they'd keep them warm. And I said, weren't you afraid of cholera? He said, no, disease. I never got diseases. It's just his thing. They were given about 100 grams of food a day, of bread a day, which is about 2 slices of bread was their ration. And there was a lot of strategy on how to deal with that. And my dad said a lot of people would keep it, hide it, save it for the next day, eat it a little bit at a time, trade it, all these strategies. My dad said that he would eat it immediately when they gave it to him because it would be in his stomach and it'd be safe. No one could steal it, couldn't get lost. And then in the next morning when he woke up, he'd be hungry, which would motivate him to go out and look for more food, to steal or whatever, because that's how he was going to make it. And that was his mantra. So they would scavenge, they would steal potatoes from farm fields or carrots or radishes or whatever they could find. If they could get a chicken or a pig, whatever they could steal, that's just what they did. And the other story he tells is he was out with 3 or 4 buddies one night scavenging for food. They would climb trees and get eggs out of nests. And they were invited into a farmhouse. And he told the story that it was really important to him. And this farmer said, you can come in, and we had a fire going, and they were warm in the farmhouse. He gave them some soup. So they had hit the grand slam home run. They were inside, they were warm, and they had soup. They weren't in this hole in the ground. And the farmer was asking about how the war was going and where the front was and all this other stuff. And then the farmer said, at least when the war is over, all the Jews will be dead and we won't have to deal with them anymore. So my dad said, you got a Jew sitting right here in your living room eating your soup, which was probably not a really smart thing to say. So they kicked him out and they went back to their hole in the ground, and my dad's friends were quite upset with him. So we're going to switch gears and go back to Sarny now. Sarny was occupied July 8th by the Nazis. This is an interesting picture because it's the German officers reviewing the Ukrainian militia. So they formed a local militia and they immediately sort of aligned themselves with the Nazis. And the reason they did that, one is they had sort of an organized pogrom, if you will. The Nazis said, you got 3 days, loot, rape, murder, do whatever you want. We're going to establish order, but you got a few days on your own. So it was very profitable for them. Plus, they were not occupied by the Nazis now, so they decided they'd kind of go with it. Immediately, all these rules were established, and I've been rereading that book, and they did not have yellow armbands. They had white armbands with blue Jewish stars. And it's interesting, and I think I finally learned why today. It's because this town was so Zionist that these Jews wore it with pride. The yellow thing came back from the Middle Ages, and the various societies have been making more yellow bands and dunce caps and all these things throughout history. But the blue and white they kind of wore with pride. So they started with that. They were forced to give up their valuables, their livestock, and so on. They were given 80 grams of bread a day. They had to form, work units to provide the Germans with work units. These are direct quotes from the book, and I'm not going to read them because my niece told me you don't read from your slides when you do a presentation, but you can read them if you want. But life became pretty unbearable pretty quickly. By Passover, they had established a Jewish ghetto. They split the town by the railroad tracks, and they built barbed wire fence. And they had 2 guard towers, one way in and out, and the Jews were all forced to live in the ghetto. The Jews who'd lived on the other side of town, of course, had to move over, and there were about 10 to 15 people per room, so disease and starvation spread very, very quickly. The Nazis established a Judenrat, a Jewish leadership organization. They brought in a Jew who was a lawyer from Poland, and he was the boss, and they would say, we need 15 kilograms of gold, you collect it. So he would tax them, and he would know who would probably have some money and kind of squeeze them for it. They'd beat each other. It was terrible, and there were 3 rounds of taxation. And this guy, his name was Uman, he was convinced that as long as they provided labor forces for the Nazis, and as long as they paid the taxes on schedule, that they could get through this war. By the 4th round, this genius lawyer, sorry Gary, but this genius lawyer guy had negotiated to pay this assessment, this tax, in Ukrainian script. And he still was convinced that the Germans were going to take this Ukrainian script and let the Jews live. And the Jews in town knew better. They knew what was happening, and I'll tell you why in a minute. So in my family, who was in the ghetto? We don't really know for sure. We know my grandparents were in the ghetto. I know Liepman was in the ghetto because he talked about it. And he had 3 younger brothers and sisters. We believe Herschel died as a child from a bee sting, from anaphylaxis. They didn't really have doctors and EpiPens. And so I don't know if he was in the ghetto or not, but we believe he died of sort of natural causes. I'm sorry, I'm going to go back for a second. Nahum also was not on the final list of when the Nazis liquidated the ghetto. They had very good records, and Nahum was not on the list, nor was my grandfather. So we believe somewhere during the occupation or from disease, starvation, or whatever, that my grandfather and Nahum died during that period. Henya and Ika were alive till the end, and they remained in the ghetto till it was liquidated by the Nazis. This is a page from the book with the pictures, and actually, she's registered as Julius Schuster. They didn't have his name there. And there's hundreds of these pages in that book of just the people that they had in the ghetto. After they established control in Sarny and all these decrees, the Einsatzgruppen came in. They were the killing squads. They were not sending people to concentration camps. They were killing them on site. They dug 4 large pits in the forest adjacent to Sarny. And I guess it was this Einsatzgruppen C that probably did Sarny. The people, and this is important, the people in Sarny knew that they were going to be killed. They knew what was going to happen. And the reason they knew is when this was happening in Western Poland, there were refugees. There were Jews who had escaped, who had run eastward, who got caught in Sarny. And they said, oh no, we know in this town, there was a massacre. They would shoot 500 people a time. They told them exactly what was going to happen. And there was no secret about it. And here's again some eyewitnesses, some people who wrote this book who were sure what was going to happen to them. August 27th and 28th, the massacre occurred in Sarny. And it's interesting, that's my birthday. I was born exactly 16 years later after my family was murdered. It was a hot day in Sarny, and they marched people in groups 5 across and groups of 50 by family alphabetical order to this barbed wire concentration area where surprisingly, they had already brought by train people from 4 or 5 neighboring villages. So it was already super packed there by some of their neighboring villages. And they also had about 100 gypsies who were murdered that same period. In that they were in a enclosed area. It was hot. There was a drainage ditch behind them with some dirty runoff water. And the people who last saw my grandmother and my aunt said that she had managed to bribe one of these Ukrainian policemen, and he'd given her some of this dirty water, and my aunt, the little girl, was drinking it out of a shoe before they were murdered that day. Ooh, I'm going to go back. I'm sorry. So I'm supposed to ask, you're in this situation, you know what's going to happen. What are your choices? I mean, you really have 3 or 4 choices. So the kids were really good at this. One kid, these are great kids. One kid said, fight or flight. So there's actually a few more choices, but I never want to correct a kid. He was a great kid. Fight, flight. The other one was hide. And the 4th really was, this is our fate. Some of these people were deeply religious, and it was their fate, and they were going to be martyrs, and they were going to just die with their families with dignity. So those were the 4 choices. Well, it turns out there was an organized rebellion in Sarnia, and that's really why this book is here, and this is why we know so much. They had collected some benzene, I guess that's gasoline or some kind of petroleum product, and they had some farming implements and some axes and some shears and some other tools, and they simultaneously blew up 3 buildings where the Nazis were headquartered, and they cut through the barbed wire fence in this concentration area from which they were being led to the killing fields. And it was a mess. There's another word, but I'm not going to use it. Everybody started running towards this breach in the fence, and of course the machine guns came out and the grenades came out, so they were all being shot at. There were dead people, so they were climbing over dead people to get across the fence. But about 1,000 people, many of them who authored this book, got out that day, never made it. It made this operation for the Germans and the Ukrainians a disaster because there was blood everywhere. They had to go, people ran back to town, back to their houses, into the forest. So they're now hunting over the whole region for all these Jews, many of them which were caught and eventually killed, many of them which escaped.
Hey,
Yes?
Can I stop you real quick? Because my dad does so much history on all, his
We're going to do Q&A. I'm sorry, Alec, but we're going to do a Q&A
I just
thing.
wanted to know about the book, that's all.
Okay.
Where did you find it?
It was, my dad bought it at Yad Vashem at the Holocaust Memorial in Israel. It's out of publishing now, but it's on, you can look at it on the web. It's translated in English. You can read every page of it on the web.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome. And there's hundreds of books like these from all these villages that tell the unique story of those villages. So this is the description of the rebellion, which I just kind of summarized for you. Also, my father had an aunt who who survived. She actually fell into the pit, and then she realized she was alive, so she waited till dark and then escaped. This is not Sarny. This is Einsatzgruppen, and just a picture. The Nazis took a lot of pictures, video of these operations, but it was probably similar to what happened in Sarny. The children under 12 were not shot individually. They were thrown into a pit, and they used hand grenades, and they were sort of buried alive or injured. Well, while in those months, while Sarny was being liquidated, my father was in Stalingrad, which is where the Soviets decided would be the last stand for the Germans. Stalingrad was besieged. It was occupied by, or surrounded by the Germans. There was no food. People were starving. Diseases rampant. And he said, we're going to fight house to house, man to man, but we're not going to let the Nazis go any further. And this is where my father was. And he fought in that battle and tried to find food. And when Stalingrad was successfully conquered, they stayed to rebuild the city. The city was in shambles, and the Soviets populated the city with people from various labor camps to rebuild the city and get the industries going again. And my mother was shipped from a labor camp in Siberia to Stalingrad with a trainload of women. My father happened to see these women get off the train, and he approached this woman, and he said, "You look like a Jewish woman. I think I'm going to marry you." And she said, "What's it to you?" Or whatever. But he helped her with some food, and eventually she caught on to his unique charm. My dad used to say that a Russian could survive a Russian winter by wrapping these rags around their feet. They had a system where they could take old clothes and wrap them around their feet, and they could get through a winter. And my mother had rags around her feet when she came off that train from Siberia. And there were still German prisoners of war being marched around town who had shoes. So my dad liberated a pair of boots for my mom so she could have shoes. This was their wedding day, April 30th, 1945 in Stalingrad.
They both look so happy.
That's just how it was. And my dad managed to get a white shirt, and my mom was wearing some kind of black work dress, but somebody gave her what looks like a doily to make it look kind of festive. And they got married in a Soviet civil fashion. To make a long story shorter, or longer, I'm not sure, they, with the help of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, were considered displaced people and made their way eventually back to Sarny. In Sarny, my father, of course, did not find his mother or did not find their house, but he was recognized by one of his neighbors and thrown off of a tram because they recognized him as a Jew, and he broke his femur. So he ended up there for about 3 months in the hospital. He tells a story about the doctor who took care of him was actually a German prisoner of war physician, which is kind of interesting. He did well, and then the locals wanted to charge him to get out of the hospital, but my mother found some Soviet soldiers who had a truck, and they liberated him from the hospital. And they had seen on a bulletin board that his brother had survived the war as well. And they followed his brother and eventually caught up with him in Anzio Beach, Italy, where they were in a displaced persons camp. So the two brothers, my dad and his brother, reunited with their brides, and his brother had their first child, Sarah, in the DP camp, and she was born there. It was a great vacation for them. They stayed there 2.5, 3 years. They ate every day. They had food from the United Nations UNRWA, I forget what it stands for, and they had a lot of fun. My dad said that they got food from America that he couldn't eat. It was peanut butter and crackers. And he said that he thought of himself as a very smart businessman, so he would take this food and go into town and he would trade it for things that were important, like cigarettes and wine and fruits and vegetables. Then he'd bring it back to the camp and he'd sell it. He said after a while he had a little store in the DP camp, and even at one point owned his own scale, and he was really proud of himself. He saved his money in the DP camp, and my dad bought a radio. He talked about this radio because he was really proud of himself. And there's a little boy that used to sleep with him and my mom. He was about a 9-year-old boy. He was an orphan, a survivor, and he was waiting for papers to go to Israel. And he had a goofy name like Vershinsky or something. I can't remember it. But when that boy got papers to go to Israel, my father thought long and hard about it. He said, I'm going to go to America. I'm going to be a businessman and I'll do fine. I'm going to give this kid that radio. So he sent that little 9-year-old boy to Israel with that radio. And they used to write each other from time to time, but I think they eventually lost touch. My brother was born in Italy. And on day 8, they had a bris. That's a Jewish celebration for male babies born. And this picture is my mom and dad at the bris. They had wine, they had food, they had all these little families with all these kids. The birth rate in the DP camps in Europe was 37 times higher than the birth rate in the neighboring Italy or Germany or Austria where these camps were, because these people wanted to start families and get their lives going. And that's what they did. That's my brother, my Italian brother, and my parents. Last time I'm going to thank Ann, but Ann found this. This is the manifest from the ship they came on. I had no idea. I knew they came in December 49 on the ship, and that's their names. They landed in New York, but they were trained over to Buffalo to be with my mother, who had some uncles who came over in around 1900, uncles and aunts. And Ann found these papers. That's a picture from my brother's bar mitzvah, and those are my aunts and uncles who helped my parents when they got here, and they're being honored at his bar mitzvah, lighting a candle. And I'm sorry, I wanted to point out that they were sponsored by this organization called USNA, and that stood for United in Service to New Americans, and that was an American Jewish women's organization that was so frustrated that the organized Jewish community was doing nothing for these refugees that they just got their crap together and started sponsoring random people, which is pretty cool. And I didn't know that till all this. So I really like these two pictures, and I really enjoy telling the kids that, because many of them know that there's all kinds of families. Not everybody has just a nuclear family with parents and cousins and sisters and brothers, and we're the same way. And apparently when these immigrants came to the United States, some Americans called them this kind of derogatory nickname called greenhorns. And that meant they just didn't know much about American language and culture, and they were a little unsophisticated. And they, in fact, were a little unsophisticated. So they adopted this nickname for themselves, and they Yiddishized it, and they called themselves Greener, which means unsophisticated. And they kind of enjoyed that. And this is just some random picture from, a wedding or bar mitzvah or something, and they're all greener, and they had a lot of fun hanging out. And this was sort of our real family. Incidentally, that woman right there is Wolf Blitzer's mother. So,
In the pink?
yeah. And yes. He went to our high school, or we went to his high school, or whatever. This is a picture of me and my dad, and I put that picture in there because when you grow up in a family like this, what you realize is that your parents make sacrifices that are almost impossible to understand for us as parents. And Kinder in Yiddish or in German means your children, and they really did everything for us. And I put that picture in there because my dad walked around like that with a broken tooth for probably 10 or 15 years. He never went to the dentist or the doctor, but somehow I had violin lessons. I didn't realize that when I was a kid, but you go back and you look at this picture and you go, it's kind of an amazing story. So that's why I put that in there. In 1960, both my parents and my brother had to take the test to become U.S. citizens. He must not have been in a good mood for the picture. Or maybe, I don't know, maybe his teeth weren't, whatever. But they had to take a test. Even my brother had to study for the test. And my dad never was big on reading or writing, so he didn't really study for the test. And he used to joke that they asked him, who's George Washington? And he said, I don't know, but I bet he was a good guy. They passed him, so he became a citizen. So we lived in Buffalo, and they had three, Esther and me and their friends who ate too much and wore a lot of polyester. They went to parties, and they had kind of a pretty normal life. In 1989, they moved to Birmingham, and these two pictures are kind of favorites. This is the house I grew up in. My dad, the house for whatever reasons didn't have numbers on it. My dad bought these numbers when I was a little kid, and he used Quickcrete, and he just slapped it on. And it lasted 30 years. It's still kind of ugly and crooked, but it was how my dad did, and it worked for him. It was a greenhorn move. It was 14 degrees the day we moved into Buffalo. My dad was wearing a flannel shirt, no gloves, and his Russian hat, because this is how he was. My mom packed up the house in the boxes from the liquor store across the street, and in our house we had pictures on the wall because my dad had befriended this Polish homeless guy named Stanislaw Pazurkiewski, who lived with us for 6 months. And he was an artist and a builder and an alcoholic. And my dad loved the guy, and he painted on the walls. He painted on canvas. I have a framed picture in my basement. He built a bathroom in our basement with no sink. And then he had a seizure and vomited, and my mother was afraid he died, and she made us send him home. Or he'd probably be living at my house now. So when they had their 50th anniversary here in Birmingham, we decided it was time for a real wedding, and my mom could wear a dress, and we had it at Temple Beth El. It was really fun, and they were able to invite their friends and their kids and grandkids, and it was a special day in their life. And I have a little clip from that. Can you press play? I don't know how to do it.
Don't look at me.
You just press for about 10-15 seconds. Yeah. Go ahead. You can cut it. There you go. So that was my dad saying the blessing over the wine at his wedding, and it was we had a little band. It was just fun. Oops, sorry. So I think somewhere in the Torah or the Talmud it says if you save a life, it's as if you saved the world. So this is my mom and dad with their children. My son was missing that night, but with all the grandchildren except one. And this is 2 years ago at Passover Seder in Israel. There were about 50 or 60 Schusters there. And the little kids, a lot of them, because a lot of my cousins are women, they've changed their names. The little kids did not know they were Schusters. And so they started a WhatsApp group called Schusterim, Schusters, so they can all be in touch. There's so many of them. They all didn't even know each other. And they also didn't know they were Russian. And one of the, Boaz, he's about 25 years old, goes, all these years I hate these Russians, and now I found out I'm a damn Russian. So time goes on. This is 10 Schuster cousins. The 2 Ukrainians were missing, but that was at a wedding in Israel, I don't know, about 5 years ago. So in 2000, I decided to go back to Sarny, and I couldn't have done it without Paul Nagrotsky, who's right here and right there. Paul and I went back and we visited our ancestral towns, and I met my cousins for the first time. I was 45 years old, or 42 years old, and met my cousins and their kids for the first time, and we had an amazing trip. Sarny is on the borderline. Today it's in Western Ukraine, but they spell it in Russian and in Polish because they still don't really know who they are. This guy is the mayor, and he was dressed up in a Ukrainian Cossack shirt, and he was very kind to us. And he spoke a few words in Ukrainian, then we had a translator with us. And the first thing he said was, maybe you'll be more comfortable if I speak Russian. This man who grew up in the Soviet Union was a mayor of a Ukrainian city, but couldn't speak Ukrainian. It's a confusing place. He also gave Paul and I gifts. I got a whole show and tell out in the library, but one of the gifts is a locally made switchblade. Gave Paul and I one. And a book of Lenin's works. It's out there, and some other things. This city seal, kind of a seal of the city, which the emblem has always been the goat, which, anyway, it's an interesting place. So we went back to the town. We walked around with my cousins. We saw this is from the book, the water tower, and this is the water tower today, or in 2000. This is the soccer pitch, which was the Jewish cemetery, which was completely dismantled and made a soccer pitch. They used all the gravestones for paving and building and so on. We walked around, and the mayor promised us he'd show us where my parents lived, my dad lived, but he never kind of came around with that. This is our interpreter, Natasha, who is an amazing lady. And this is what it looks like today. Not a whole lot different. And I imagine that my dad, his house was something like that. We wanted to go to these 4 pits to see these killing fields, and we wanted to say a prayer and at my grandparents' grave, and we were looking for it, and we couldn't find exactly where we were going. We met this woman, this old woman, and her granddaughter, and our interpreter told her what we were looking for, and she just started giggling. She thought it was funny. And she said, "Are you looking for dead Jews?" And we said, "Yes, we're here. We're looking for dead Jews." And she says, You're on them. Everywhere you look, it was a mess. And I didn't really understand, but was describing this breach in the fence and Jews running everywhere and dead people everywhere. And she said, this big sandy pit, there was just dead Jews everywhere. We wanted to go to see the mass graves, and there's a famous mass grave that is the cover of this group, because of the 4 pits, survivors went back and put a gravestone on them. We found this one, which I had not seen from the book, just a mountain. They'd covered it up with the Jewish star. This one, the monument said something like, "Here lie victims of fascism." It was a Soviet monument, and they did not acknowledge that they were specifically Jewish people. And this monument, which is from the book, this big one, we couldn't get to. We were told this big monument is behind this fenced off military area. They were doing some military stuff, and it was barbed wired off, and they did not let us go back there, so we never saw it. That's a picture of me and my dad at our house just hanging out. We did that a lot. And that's a picture of my grandson. I just had to throw that in at the end. He's the youngest Schuster, and his name is Paul after my mother Pauline, and his Hebrew name is Yehuda after my dad. That's all I got. Thank you. Questions? Yes, ma'am.
Why did you move to Birmingham?
So my sister was already here with her husband, and she just found her way here because she met this guy. And I was in Atlanta, and we used to come back and visit all the time. And